Welcome to Interpretation of Statutes. It's a very dense, complicated, technical module, and I will try to take you through the basics of the learning outcomes for each learning unit in the course of this of these recordings. So before you can start learning about interpreting statutes, you need to somehow figure out what a statute is. And in order to do that, you need to figure out what the law is. So every society has laws, and it is impossible for a society to function properly if there aren't any laws. The laws made up of, in South Africa, several different aspects. First, we start with indigenous laws. So long before the first colonization in South Africa, there were indigenous people living here. And these indigenous people had their own sets of law because they lived in societies that functioned particularly well. And those laws, in a way, through the years have survived. And to some extent, some of those laws are still valid and in use, unless it has been either repealed or declared unconstitutional by the court. Then we have common law. So when the Dutch first arrived in South Africa back in the 1600s, they brought with them a set of laws from the Netherlands. And this was Roman Dutch law. So it was law that was developed as a combination of Roman law and Dutch law as it was there, practiced there. And most of this law is unwritten. Some of it is written in the sense that you'll find it in a textbook. It's been written down in a textbook, but it's not been codified. It's not part of a piece of legislation. So once again, most of this remains in force unless it's been either repealed, replaced by other legislation, or declared unconstitutional by the courts. Then we have legislation, and that is what we will be focusing on mostly, or almost exclusively from here on. Legislation is an act that has been passed and promulgated by Parliament and that regulates how society functions. The last bit that you need to know about is case law or judicial precedent. And the principle behind this is very simple, that any higher court's judgments bind equal and lower courts. So any judgment from the Constitutional Court will bind every other court in South Africa. The SCA, Supreme Court of Appeal, would bind the high courts and lower courts, and each division of the high court only high courts once again and lower courts. So we have the separation of powers in South Africa, and typically courts have a judicial function, not a legislative function. But there's a bit of overlapping because the courts do have a lawmaking function, and that is what we see in interpretation of statutes, where the courts either interpret and in that way make law, or the court can declare law, a piece of legislation, an act or a section of an act unconstitutional, and that means that that is no longer valid and can't continue. So, what is legislation? That's what we need to know. Legislation is defined as an enacted law text. And if you look here, see, I've tried to break this down for you a little bit. Enacted means that it's adopted or issued or promulgated, all means pretty much the same thing in terms of the prescribed legal requirements. So, for instance, you will find that it's been published by the government printers in the Government Gazette, and that's how usually it's promulgated. Have the force of law. So there are things that are published by the Government Gazette which are not laws. So all laws are published in the Government Gazette, but not everything in the Government Gazette is law, has the force of law. Sometimes there would be a draft bill published in the Government Gazette that invites commentary, and that does not have the force of law. So you've got to distinguish between those. And it is in text. It's written down. That is a requirement. What is statutory interpretation? So there are a couple of rules and principles that we'll look at throughout the course that will explain to you what statutory interpretation is. But essentially, it's about the court taking a piece of legislation and reading it, understanding it, and applying it to a concrete situation. Why do we need to interpret acts? Because sometimes it's written in such a way that it's not clear. It's either because of an ambiguity in language or simply because sometimes it's written in what we call legalese. What's legalese? Here's an example for you. You take the simple nursery rhyme. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after us, the rest of it. So you take that and you translate it into legalese. And I'm not going to read that whole long paragraph because it will take 20 minutes. Just the first couple of lines. The party of the first part hereinafter known as Jack, and the party of the second part hereinafter known as Jill. Ascended or caused to be ascended, an elevation of undetermined height and degree of slope, hereinafter referred to as hill, etc., etc. So, what did I say now? All of that was Jack and Jill went up the hill. That is the reason why sometimes we do need to interpret statutes. Right. I'm going to pause here so that these don't get too long, and we'll pick up here again in the next recording.